It's 1969. Welcome to the summer of love. But there's no love for the Grammys as they continue to make a hash out of the music industry. This year, they ignore one of the biggest hard rock and heavy metal bands of all time. Find out who next. Welcome, metal enthusiasts, to another edition of Fixing the Grammys. This year we are looking at examining the year 1969. And once again, we find ourselves having to correct another blunder by the Grammys. For those of you who have not been following the series, what we're basically going to do is we're going to nominate 5 artists for the best hard rock heavy metal performance of 1969. Very similar to the award that's given out today. And then we're going to take those nominees and especially the winner and see how they would compare with other categories that the Grammys handed out that year, such as Album of the Year, Song of the Year. I can tell you right now that, again, the Grammys have ignored one of the biggest acts in the history of heavy metal, in the history of hard rock. So we need to examine that a little more closely. But before we get to this year's nominees, if you haven't had a chance, please subscribe to this channel. Hit the like button, all the things that will help a growing channel out. With that being said, let's get to the nominees. Our first nominee is Grand Funk Railroad and the song Inside Looking Out. Now, if you want to get my attention, the best way to do it is doing Eric Burton and the Animals cover. I love Eric Burton and the Animals, one of the most underrated bands in the history of music. They have had so many great songs covered by so many talented heavy metal and hard rock bands over the years, and this is no exception. This is a perfect jam song, and Mark Farner's voice and his guitar have never sounded better. But the star of this song is actually the bass player, Mel Schlosser. I hope I'm saying your name right, Mel. You deserve all the credit. The bass in this song is insane. I love this song to death, and it is our first nominee. Once again, Grand Funk Railroad with the song Inside Looking Out. Our second nominee is from one of the biggest heavy metal hard rock bands of all time. Led Zeppelin 1, the album by Led Zeppelin that started it all. Jimmy Page, Robert Plant, John Bonham, and John Paul Jones. The great Led Zeppelin. Now, Jimmy Page, interestingly enough, is the third Yardbird to leave the nest. And when Led Zeppelin was formed, the critics panned it for an interesting reason. If you were with us last week, one of the nominees for hard rock and heavy metal was the Jeff Beck Group for their album Truth. Jeff Beck was the second Yardbird to leave the nest and form his own band. And so now, as Jimmy Page is doing it, Rolling Stone basically accused him of being a cheap ripoff of the Jeff Beck Group. Jeff Beck leaves the Yardbirds. Jimmy Page leaves the Yardbirds. Jeff Beck incorporates a young, charismatic lead singer in Rod Stewart. Jimmy Page gets a young, charismatic voice lead singer, Robert Plant. And so the story went, they were just ripping off the Jeff Beck Group. But nothing could be farther from the truth. Led Zeppelin was much better. You see, Eric Clapton and Jeff Beck are probably considered purely scientifically as the better guitarists of the three. Now, that gets a little tricky because it really starts to devolve into personal taste. But I think where Jimmy Page shines, maybe he's not, as good of a player as the other two. And let's just stop right here before people get offended. All three of these guitarists are Hall of Fame level guitarists. So being third in this race is by no means an insult. But the one area that Jimmy Page clearly outshines the other two, and the skill that probably puts him to the top of the list, is his songwriting. Because while Jeff Beck plays fantastic, in fact, of the three, maybe Jeff Beck is my favorite guitarist to listen to, just if I'm listening to a jam. One of the great pleasures of my life is I got to see a co-headlining tour a few years back with the late great Stevie Ray Vaughan and Jeff Beck. And let me just say, it was magical. When I'm having a tough day at work or whatever the case may be, I can look back and go, man, you saw some great guitars that night. But where Jeff Beck and Eric Clapton, I think, failed to grab the public attention is they're just not as good of songwriters as Jimmy Page and the boys from Zeppelin. Because this album, song after song, just fantastic songwriting. In my opinion, Eric Clapton and Jeff Beck never once wrote a song as good as, Dazed and Confused. That's the reason Zeppelin rose to the levels they did, where, many of the Eric Clapton, Jeff Beck solo projects failed to become big hits. Meanwhile, Zeppelin arguably was the biggest band in the 70s. So coming in, our second nominee from the mighty Led Zeppelin, the album Led Zeppelin 1. Our third nominee is also Led Zeppelin for the album Led Zeppelin 2. That's right, Led Zeppelin had 2 releases in 1969. And if you've been following the channel, you will realize that was not an uncommon thing. We saw both the Doors and Jimi Hendrix have multiple albums in the same year. Very different from today's recording sessions, which are usually albums can be anywhere from 2 to 5 years between albums. Now, Led Zeppelin is part of what is referred to as the British Big Three: Black Sabbath, Led Zeppelin, and Deep Purple. Now, usually when people are talking about Deep Purple, they're usually talking about Mark II and beyond, which starts in about a year. And of course, Black Sabbath starts in about a year. So in 1969, Led Zeppelin has a stage all to themselves, and they make the most of it by putting out 2 of the greatest albums in the history of hard rock and heavy metal. It'll be interesting to see as they go head-to-head this year if one of these albums ends up being the winner. Coming in at number 3, Led Zeppelin 2. Our fourth nominee is a band by the name of MC5 and their song Kick Out the Jams, Mother Trucker. Now, MC5 does a couple of very unique things. Number 1, this is their debut album, and it's also a live album. I can't think of another example of a band that comes right out of the gates with a live album. If there's other bands that have done this and done it successfully, put it in the comments below. I'm not aware of anybody that's ever done that before, so very unique. The second thing is they use the term Mother Trucker, which was quite controversial, as you can imagine, way back in 1969. It kind of led to them getting into all sorts of trouble with their record labels. Controversy was not in this case, a good thing for the band, and they kind of lost their way a little bit, getting tossed between record labels, etc. Now, some people may dispute their inclusion on this list. Many people might say MC5. What's a punk rock band doing here? Are they punk rock? Are they metal? Are they hard rock? I don't know, but they're definitely loud rock. And this channel celebrates good, loud music, no matter what the genre. So they get a place on the list as the fourth nominee, MC5. Kick out the jam, Mother Trucker. Now, I'm a sucker for a great guitar riff. And our fifth and final nominee comes in with one of the all-time great guitar riffs. Spooky Tooth with the song Better by You, Better Than Me. Now, many of you may be familiar with this song because it was covered by another legendary heavy metal band, about 7 years in the future. Judas Priest covered this song on their Stained Class album. That was where I was introduced to this song. But, once I realized it was a cover, went out and explored what that song sounded like. And yes, Judas Priest does it better. But Spooky Tooth deserves the credit here because, again, they just wrote one of the classic riffs in the history of hard rock and heavy metal. A great song, and I just felt like it needed to be included as one of the nominees. Now, I do want to take a quick second to also talk about an honorable mention, and that is King Crimson with 21st Century Schizoid Man. I bring it up for a couple of reasons. Number one, it was recently included in the top 100 heavy metal songs of all time by Rolling Stone. And two, this song has a huge influence in heavy metal. Now, I'm not a big fan of this song or this band, but this is definitely the beginning of progressive metal. In other words, this is, we have a lot of, we talked about the blues influencing metal, whether it be Jimi Hendrix, whether we talk about Jimmy Page, whether we talk about Jeff Beck. Those bands all have a very heavy blues influence. King Crimson is really where that progressive sound starts to come into heavy metal music, hard rock music, and influences so many bands. So I do think it's worth noting and stopping here to give them their full credit. If you are a person who loves progressive rock or loves progressive metal, this is thought to be one of the pioneering albums and songs. And so I do mention it here again. King Crimson, 21st Century Schizoid Man, gets an honorable mention for 1969. So we've got all 5 nominees in their place, and the winner is all right, it's not much of a spoiler, I suppose, at this point, if you couldn't tell by the introduction. But the battle here is clearly between Led Zeppelin 1 and Led Zeppelin 2. It's hard to do these without gushing about one of my favorite bands of all time, and that would be Led Zeppelin. While their other 3 nominees put out great songs that year, these 2 albums really stand the test of time and are still beloved and listened to today, well over 50 years later. Now, the winner of this category, drum roll please, is Led Zeppelin 2, but it's very close. Led Zeppelin 1, the first side, and for those of you who've never listened to albums and have always listened to CDs, when we listen to music back in the day, we listened to sides of albums. And that becomes a very hard thing to get away from when you talk about music today. I just, that's the way we listen to music. So it's how I listen to these albums for many, many years. And Led Zeppelin 1, the first side, is absolute perfection. It starts off with good times, bad times, and ends with the great, hypnotic, dazed and confused. Side 2 is also very good, maybe not quite as good as side 1, but it ends up with How Many More Times. Not only does it close the album, for many years, Led Zeppelin closed their concerts with this song, and it is an absolute classic. But while Led Zeppelin 1 has a perfect album side, Led Zeppelin 2 may be the first album we've reviewed on this channel that I consider perfection from start to finish. The entire album, one great song after another. So if you've never listened to Led Zeppelin 2, I highly recommend it. It is, to me, the single greatest album in the entire decade of the 60s. So there you go. It had to win, but boy, it was a tougher choice than you think to put it ahead of Led Zeppelin 1. But at the end of the day, I think it might be just a little bit more consistent from front to back. So with that being said, how would Led Zeppelin or any of our other nominees fare in the larger categories that the Grammys were awarding that year? Let's find out. Now, I just got through saying that I think Led Zeppelin may have just had the album of the 60s. So obviously I think that they probably would win Album of the Year in 1969. But that honor went to Blood, Sweat, and Tears. A good band, but again, when you look at the history of music and the impact of Led Zeppelin 2, hands down, should win Album of the Year. Now, as far as the Song of the Year, we talked a little bit about this. Great riffs and how I have a soft spot for great guitar riffs. Well, you can't find a more contagious riff than on the song Heartbreaker off Led Zeppelin 2. Song of the Year, you bet. The winner that year was a guy by the name of Joe South with the song Games People Play. Once again, I think pretty easy win here. Should have gone to Led Zeppelin. That song has, long since surpassed poor Joe South. The best male vocalist that year went to Harry Nilsson. And once again, let me just be unapologetically in the corner of Mr. Robert Plant. Now, you can pick just about any song off Led Zeppelin 1 or 2, but I'm going to go with Dazed and Confused because I believe this song is so hypnotic and Robert Plant's voice is just pitch perfect throughout. Again, you can pick any song off either of these two albums, and Robert Plant's going to give you one hell of a performance. But I'm going to go with Dazed and Confused here. And for the best instrumental rock song, I'm going... Let me pause for a second. I have been notoriously biased towards guitarists. I've been talking about Led Zeppelin for the last 10 minutes. Jimmy Page this, Robert Plant this. Let's give the greatest drummer, potentially of all time, a little love here. And the instrumental, we're going to go with that drummer. Moby Dick, with the great, iconic John Bonham, may he rest in peace. When John Bonham passes away in 1980, Led Zeppelin never recorded another album. They didn't, go find another drummer. And the reason why is simple. How do you replace the greatest drummer that's ever lived? John Bonham was fantastic. I would be remiss if I didn't mention him. And this drum solo that he has here, again, off Led Zeppelin 2, is fantastic and something they played in concert for many, many years. Now, I've been a little hard on the Grammys, but I will say they did nominate Led Zeppelin to be Newcomers of the Year. They didn't win, but they at least nominated them. I guess at least the Grammys knew they existed. At least they, gave them some credit. But instead, they picked Crosby, Stills, and Nash. Crosby, Stills, and Nash. Huge band. But they're not Led Zeppelin, people. Newcomer of the Year has to be Led Zeppelin. Again, they just put out two of the greatest albums in the history of rock and roll. Crosby, Stills, and Nash. I have no problem them being nominated. They were also a very big, popular band, but I don't know. We've been at this 3 years, and it's another clean sweep for the hard rock and heavy metal boys. Led Zeppelin takes home the Album of the Year, Song of the Year, vocals, instrumentals, and newcomers. It's a clean sweep. Can you tell I think Led Zeppelin was a little deserving that year? The fact that the Grammys gave them not a single award just once again reinforces the fact that the Grammys were completely out of touch and literally missed probably the biggest band in the history of hard rock and heavy metal, and at least probably the biggest hard rock band of the 70s at the very least. They got one nomination. Oh, Grammys. Let's see if you do even better next decade, because you completely bombed in the 60s. Well, that wraps up this week's episode. I hope you enjoyed the year 1969. It also wraps up the decade of the 60s. So for you that have been patiently waiting, 1970 is just around the corner, and the birth of true heavy metal music. So you don't want to miss next week's episode. If you think that I am correct and that Led Zeppelin should have won the Grammy, give this video a thumbs up. Subscribe. Show your support for not just me, but for the mighty Zeppelin. Now, next week's going to be really exciting because, again, we are looking at the birth of heavy metal, 1970, and all three of the big British three will be putting out albums. So the competition next week, is going to be fierce. Who's going to win it? You're going to have to tune in to find out. Until then, this is the Metal Dude signing off. See you next Tuesday. And in the meantime, take care.